Okay, it is 7:15, so we're going to go ahead and get started with our class on Joshua tonight. Before we get started, as we like to do, we're going to open with our memory verse of the month. So if you will, recite this along with me, please. Your house and your kingdom will endure forever before me. Your throne will be established forever. Thank you. All right, so tonight we are going to wrap up the official part of the conquest here. We left off with this map here. We were looking at the cities that Joshua has encountered and captured at this point. He came in across to Jericho. From Jericho went up to Ai, burned both Jericho and Ai, captured Bethel, killed the king of Bethel for sure. And then after that, we had the situation with the Gibeonites, this cluster of cities here, with Gibeon being the chief city, and these were villages that were attached to it, where they were tricked into making allegiance with them. And then afterwards, they went down and started capturing a number of these cities. That, remember, if you'll recall, that there was an alliance here that moved up against Gibeon. In response to this treaty, Joshua came in, upheld his part of the alliance, and then started capturing cities in the southern portion of the land. And now we are ready to launch into the northern portion of the land. Joshua in chapter 10 and verse 43 is at Gilgal with the rest of Israel. This is this camp where he's been setting out from to capture these various cities, destroy these various kings. And now he's ready to move further north and capture all the land up above where they've been thus far. So let's go ahead and start reading in chapter 11, Joshua chapter 11, and we're going to read the first few verses here, first half of the chapter. And it came to pass, when Jabin, king of Hazor, heard these things, that he sent to Jobab, king of Madon, to the king of Shimron, to the king of Akshaph, to the kings who were from the north in the mountains, in the plains south of Chinneroth, in the lowland, and in the heights of Dor to the west, to the Canaanites in the east and in the west, the Amorite, the Hittite, the Perizzite, the Jebusites in the mountains, and the Hivite below Hermon in the land of Mizpah. So they went out, they and all their armies with them, as many people as the sand that is on the seashore in multitude, with very many horses and chariots. And when all these kings had met together, they came and camped together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. But the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid because of them, for tomorrow about this time I will deliver all of them slain before Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire." So Joshua and all the people of war went with him. All of the people of war with him came against them suddenly by the waters of Merom, and they attacked them. And the Lord delivered them into the hand of Israel, who defeated them and chased them to greater Sidon, to the brook Misrephoth, to the valley of Mizpah eastward. They attacked them until they left none of them remaining. So Joshua did to them as the Lord had told him. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots with fire. Joshua turned back at that time and took Hazor and struck its king with the sword, for Hazor was formerly the head of all these kingdoms. And they struck all the people who were in it with the edge of the sword, utterly destroying them. There was none left breathing. Then he burned Hazor with fire. So all the cities of those kings and all their kings Joshua took and struck with the edge of the sword. He utterly destroyed them, as Moses the servant of the Lord had commanded. But as for the cities that stood on their mounds, Israel burned none of them, except Hazor only, which Joshua burned. And all the spoil of these cities and the livestock, the children of Israel took as booty for themselves. But they struck every man with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them, and they left none breathing. As the Lord had commanded Moses his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua, and so Joshua did. He left nothing undone of all that the Lord had commanded Moses. So let's go ahead and start out. We've talked at various times about the responses of the Canaanite nations. Jericho was terrified and shut themselves up inside the city. The kings of Jerusalem, a number of the cities, moved to fight against Joshua. Gibeon decided to try a different tactic and was going to use deceit and peace. How did the northern Canaanite nations respond to the Israelite victories in the south thus far? Yeah. So they gathered together and brought in a coalition of a large number of people. We talked about in the south, we had this alliance of, in chapter 10, Jerusalem and Hebron and Jarmuth and Lachish and Eglon. So it's a 5-nation or a 5-city rather alliance. And remember, they weren't actually moving against Israel at this point. They were moving against Gibeon in response to the treaty they had made with Israel. In this case, this is different. They moved to actually fight against Israel in this moment. And it wasn't just 5, right? It was a lot. Who was this instigated by? Who was the leader of this army? The king of Hazor. So, on the map, Hazor is right there. North of the Sea of Galilee by about 8.5 miles, and just a few miles south of Lake Hula, right about there. It's a large city. It's the largest one that they've encountered thus far. It's called in chapter 11 and verse 10, the head of all the kingdoms. So it's going to be the biggest one that they've encountered thus far. Okay, this is Hazor today. This is what's referred to as the upper city, and everything else that you see here, including what's off of the map, off the picture, is the lower city. The remains of this city cover about 200 acres. Compare that to Jericho, which was 7 acres in size. Ai was a little bit smaller than that. This is the biggest thing they have encountered thus far. Hazor, this upper city portion, which you see in this tell right here, consisted of the main palace, and we've seen remnants of this palace when they've done archaeological digs. It also contained a small temple, which they believe was for private worship of the king of Hazor, because they found a much larger idol temple to Baal somewhere else on the lower ends of the city. And the lower city consisted of dwellings and public buildings. They believe that up to 40,000 people lived in the city in its heyday, which was during the time when Joshua was attacking. After that, as we read about, Joshua destroys Hazor. It is rebuilt. It is utilized by the kings of Israel later. But it's never quite to its glory. Israel rebuilds here in the upper portion of the city. And so you'll see various things on this map. There's a gate structure here that Solomon built that's referenced in 1 Kings 9:15. There's some northern walls, some structures and things like that. There's a well over here. Here's where the palace of Jabin was actually. And then all of this is the lower city that we're talking about here. Okay. They found all kinds of different things in this area. Interestingly enough, what was the name of the king? Jabin, right? That name is referenced in Joshua 11. It's also referenced in Judges 4, where we see Deborah going up against Jabin, the king of Hazor. Okay, and so for a long time, this was believed by skeptics to be a contradiction and an error in the Bible. Well, Jabin was killed in Joshua. How can he also be alive in Judges? Later, this tablet here was a cuneiform tablet that was excavated in 1992 at Hazor. Cuneiform was a language here. Is these wedges you see that are tapped out, and these are symbols, and they mean things to the people who wrote them at the time. It's dated to be the 17th or 18th century based on the strata and the levels and things that was found around it. So this predates Joshua. We're talking about the days of Joseph, okay, or a little bit after Joseph here. And it talks about Jabin, the king of Hazor. And so it is believed that Jabin was a royal term in the way that we would describe Pharaoh or Caesar or a Candace of Ethiopia. And so this was a royal title that these kings actually took on, and they had a secondary name that was able to delineate exactly which Jabin we are talking about. Does that make sense? It's really cool how we're digging up and finding things that are described in the Bible, and there's no contradiction here. It should strengthen and encourage us in our faith. So Jabin here reaches out to these nations and asks for an alliance in order to fight against the Israelites. It mentions a couple of cities here specifically in chapter 11. You have Madon and Shimron and Akshaph. And so these are cities that are located here a little bit further to the south and west. This is where we believe these two cities are located. Shimron, we have a much better understanding of where that was located, but that's not all he reached out to, right? We see that's in verse 1 of chapter 11. Then we see the kings of the north in the mountains. If you recall, this is all mountainous regions, but he reached out to the Canaanite nations further north of him in those hills as well. That's in verse 2. In the plains to the south of Chinroth, this is the Sea of Galilee. So in this region down here, he's reaching out to those kings as well. In the lowlands, in the heights of Dor. Dor was located on the coast, and so he's reaching out to kings in this region. Dor is actually a city here, but there are other cities located in that area as well. Verse 3, the Canaanites in the east and in the west, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Jebusites in the mountains, the Hivites below Hermon, in the land of Mizpah. This is that region here, Mizpah, and that's Mount Hermon up in the far north of this map. Jabin is reaching out to everybody he knows. This is a large city and has a lot of ties. It's located on these main roads here. A lot of trade ties, a lot of commerce is traveling through this city. Jabin knows a lot of people, and so he's reaching out to everybody. Look, this is a problem. The alliance of the 5 cities in the south couldn't stop him. Jericho couldn't stop him. Ai couldn't stop him. We need to do something more drastic. And so they reach out for that help. Okay. What was different about the armies in chapter 11 from those they have fought thus far? Matthew. Horses and chariots. What else?
Just a massive number.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's a lot of people. More than sand is on the seashore. We've seen this phrase before in reference to Abraham and then descendants that would come after him. This is an innumerable army, more people than they faced at this point. And then horses and chariots, which is something new. If you think about, and we talked about this, what was the situation in Jericho? Did they have to go out and fight on an open plain? No, the city was shut up. It's a small city. It's the first city, and there was hand-to-hand combat, but it was after the city was already taken at that point. Later, they fight on the plains in front of Gibeon. It's a smaller nation, right? They're going in hand-to-hand combat, but what was unusual about that victory?
Is that the one where hail is coming down?
Yeah, so God routs the people, and they run away from Israel, and the hail's killing more than the sword did, as we talked about in chapter 10. So yes, there was some fighting, but God fought most of that for the people, right? And then they went and took all those cities in the south. God has been incrementally increasing these people and what they've had to face thus far. Small city, shut up. Smaller armies that are mainly being pushed away from them and they're chasing them to kill them. Now they are going to open into open warfare on the plains of Merom. God's been building their confidence, their trust in him. Through small victories, bigger victories, bigger victories. Now they're facing something they've never faced before. Something that could be terrifying to groups of nomads here. But God's been encouraging them, and he gives them promises here too. Again, in verse 6, don't be afraid because of them, for tomorrow about this time I will deliver to them slain before Israel. God's promises are true, regardless of how big The obstacle is that they have to overcome. And so they have faith in them at this time. This is the only known image of a Canaanite chariot. Okay? And so you'll see here, there's arrows, there's a spear. These are well outfitted. These are warriors who are ready to go. It's hard for me to tell, and I couldn't find anything descriptive specifically if this was one horse or two. It looks to me like there's 4 ears, so it leads me to believe that there's 2 horses here that are leading this. These are going to be people that are out on this plain moving quickly at them. Do the Israelites have horses that they're riding into battle on? No, they're foot soldiers. And so this could be terrifying, if not for the promise of, do not be afraid, I will deliver them into your hands. What was Joshua told to do with these chariots and the horses? Hamstring them. What does that mean?
Cut off the part close to like the Achilles or something.
So this is horse anatomy. This green muscle on the back is the hamstring muscle. It also encompasses somewhat this purple muscle here. This is a bicep femoris. And then there's a couple of muscles here in this green. And so you would cut right here above this hock, which would incapacitate the horse. They would rear up. If there's a rider on them, they would collapse. They would not be able to pull their chariots anymore. What's the purpose in doing this?
Also, so not to put their trust in these horses and chariots later on.
Yeah, in Deuteronomy 17:16, they're told that the king should not gather up many horses for themselves. Their trust should be in God rather than what they can accomplish for themselves through their own armies. There's removing of temptation here from before their path. They could capture the horses, capture the chariots, ride it into battle, but that's not what they're told to do. They need to trust in God's power here to do that. How did this chase look different than compared to Joshua 10? Did y'all see that? It's a little hard to see that without a map. So they fought at Merom here, which is right here to the north, or we think it's right here to the northwest of Hazor. There's some open area in this area where we think that this battle occurred. And so they're described here in verse 8. Israel delivered, and the Lord delivered them into the hand of Israel, who defeated them and chased them to Greater Sidon, to the brook Misrephoth, into the valley of Mizpah eastward, and they attacked them until none remained. We have the brook here that's described to the west. Sidon is far to the north. The valley of Mizpah is here in the Jordan River Valley to the east. What did the route look like in Joshua 10? Do y'all recall where they were fighting against the Amorite nations in front of Gibeon? I pulled up this map last week, and so you had this red dot which signified the Canaanite nations and the blue dot which signified Joshua. And Joshua chased them through Beth Horon all the way down to Azekah. This was a controlled run on a designated path. They were following this road path down until they were destroyed here by the hail, and they were being faced. That's not what we see here in Joshua 11. They are running anywhere they can to get away from Israel. They are going to the east. They are going to the north. They are going to the west. They are just trying to get away. Because as God promised, he would deliver them into the hands of Israel at this point. And none were left. Joshua chased them down, and he destroyed every single one of them as he was told to do. What did he do after he destroyed the Canaanites on the plain of battle? Where was his next stop? Hazor. He turned around and he went and defeated Hazor. What did he do to Hazor? He burned it. Why? We're not told specifically why, right? But if you think about the cities he's burned thus far, what were the 3 cities that were destroyed with fire? Jericho. Jericho was to be destroyed by fire because it was the first fruits. It was promised to God as victory. What was the next city that was destroyed by fire? Ai, right? If you think about Ai and what happened there, and the initial defeat, Ai was to be destroyed next. And then this one as well. God seems to have a purpose in mind when he's delineating which nations were to be destroyed, and which ones the people were going to come and inhabit and live in later. He doesn't always describe exactly what that reason was, but it's very few nations. None of them, he says here in verse 13, were destroyed with fire, except for Hazor amongst these cities that he's capturing here at this point. Okay. I'm going really fast. Anybody have any comments or questions up to this point? Okay. From this point, well, let's back up a little bit. So Hazor was destroyed by fire. It's really interesting to me, anyway, because I like archaeology, that when archaeologists have been digging down and excavating Hazor, they have found evidence of widespread fire in the city dated to this time frame, roughly. And they describe it as widespread devastation. Okay? It seems to be everywhere in the city. There was also evidence that there were specific targets in the city where some of these fires maybe have been stronger or started, or whatever they were looking at. They saw the fires were bigger in certain areas, which interestingly enough were the places of pagan worship. So the large temple, the smaller temple, some smaller places in the city where this worship was occurring, seems to have had a greater impact from the fire than some of the other places in the city, which I found interesting. They also found widespread devastation of fire, which translated to several decades later, which would have been roughly the time of Judges, when Deborah was leading the army against Hazor and destroying it the second time. Again, archaeological evidence which can strengthen our faith and bear out witness of what the Bible is saying and make it real in a way that sometimes we can be lost when we're just reading it as a whole. Okay, if you go to chapter 12, we're not going to read chapter 12, but I want to highlight a few things before we go back to chapter 11 here. There's a number of cities and kings here that are listed as being destroyed, and we're going to talk about this in a little bit more detail at the end of class. But the nations, or the cities rather, that are described here as being in the north, I have put here on the map. So there's a number of cities all the way up and down here that Joshua is described as taking and capturing their kings and destroying the cities, killing the people. It's summarized in chapter 12 as, so all the cities of these kings and all their kings Joshua took and struck with the edge of the sword. But it's described more in chapter 12, and it's these cities here that Joshua is described as taking and capturing and destroying. It's a lot. Joshua's busy. He's at work. He is doing and leaving nothing undone, verse 15, of all that the Lord had commanded to Moses. Okay, I do want to finish reading this chapter, but before I do, is there anything that we haven't talked about or questions or comments thus far?
You may have covered this, but what's the time frame and how long it took for them once they entered Canaan, crossed the Jordan, Jericho, and then started going up? So how much time elapsed between then and now?
Between Hazor being attacked?
Yeah, and when they started.
Mm-hmm. So we're not told the time frame of those incremental pieces. We are given rough estimations of how long the whole conquest occurred. Okay, so if you go over to chapter 14, and in verse 7, starting in verse 7, this is Caleb talking. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of the Lord, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land, and I brought back word to him as it was my heart. And so Caleb was 40 when he went out to spy out the land. Okay, that was roughly 2 years after leaving Egypt, because we are told from Kadesh Barnea, which is where they were at the time of the spying, to the time that they crossed into the land was 38 years. Okay, and that is found in Deuteronomy 2:14. Okay, then. So we see at that point, he was 40 years when they spied out the land. Verse 10. And now, behold, the Lord has kept me alive, as he has said, these 45 years, ever since the Lord spoke these words to Moses while Israel wandered in the wilderness. And now here I am on this day, 85 years old. So there has been a time frame here of the 38 years plus about 7. So there's a deficit of 7 years here from the time they crossed into the land until the land is being here distributed to the tribe of Judah for Caleb. So was it 6 years, and now we're a little bit of a lapsed time? There's a little bit of wiggle room. So somewhere between 5 to 7 years is how long this conquest took as a whole. Does that answer your question? We were going to talk about that, but I'm glad you brought it up now.
Any questions? So.
I like the question. Good. I was unsure whether we were going to talk about it today or next week, so we got it out of the way. Any other questions? Okay, let's pick it back up in chapter 11 and verse 16. Thus Joshua took all this land, the mountain country, all the south, all the land of Goshen, the lowland and the Jordan plain, the mountains of Israel and its lowlands, from Mount Halak and the ascent of Seir, even as far as Baal Gad in the valley of Lebanon, below Mount Hermon. He captured all their kings and struck them all down and killed them. Joshua made war a long time with all those kings, 5 to 7 years. There was not a city that made peace with the children of Israel except the Hivites, the inhabitants of Gibeon. All the others they took in battle, for it was of the Lord to harden their hearts, that they should come against Israel in battle, that he might utterly destroy them, and that they might receive no mercy, but that he might destroy them, as the Lord had commanded Moses. And at that time Joshua came and cut off the Anakim of the mountains, from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the mountains of Judah, and from all the mountains of Israel. Joshua utterly destroyed them with their cities. None of the Anakim were left in the land of the children of Israel. They remained only in Gaza, in Gath, and in Ashdod. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had said to Moses. And Joshua gave it as an inheritance to Israel according to their divisions by their tribes. Then the land rested from war. Okay. We have a brief summary of what we've been talking about the last few chapters. Joshua is out. He's capturing city after city after city, destroying kings, doing everything that God is telling him to do in the whole territory. I do want to ask a question in verse 20 here. We're said that Joshua took the whole land. What does this verse mean? Because we know the time of the judges are coming, right? Did I have the wrong verse on here? Yep, 23. You're right. Joshua took the whole land. Sorry about that. What does that mean, Matthew?
It seems like they've defeated all the armies, they've captured all the cities, but they haven't occupied them. So, I mean, you mentioned a tell earlier, like Azor. So this tell is basically a mound that all these cities are built on. And the reason they're built on mounds is they're basically built on the rubble of past versions of the city. The city gets destroyed, they rebuild. So I guess kind of what happens between now and Judges, they've destroyed or captured all these cities, but they haven't occupied them. The Canaanites out in the country, they come back, they rebuild, they reoccupy the cities, and because Israel hasn't occupied them, there is still going to be a little resistance left, even though Joshua has defeated all the major armies and the kings.
Yes, excellent. I saw another hand somewhere else, I thought. Yes, that is the way I would describe it too. They have broken the back of the Canaanite nations at this point, but they haven't destroyed all of them, right? There are still some that are left in various places. Let's go back to this map here. So he's capturing these cities here and their corresponding villages, but there's still large swaths of land here where we're not told anything about. We're not told about battles that occurred in this area. We're not told about cities that were captured in this area. I'm going to pull up a map here at the end of class that's going to have all the cities that are listed in chapter 12, and you'll see sections where there's emptiness, right? We're told here in this section, in verse 22, that the sons of Anakim, these are the giants, remained in Gaza and Gath and Ashdod. These are the lands of the Philistines, right? So the Canaanites are still there, but who does the land belong to? Israel. God has given it to Israel. There are still pockets of resistance. There are still battles they're going to have to overcome. Joshua has claimed the land for Israel at this point, but it does not mean that the Canaanites were completely removed from the land, and there weren't going to be any more battles that they were going to have to fight here. There were still going to be things they were going to have to overcome, but Joshua has claimed it for the nation of Israel to occupy. And that's where we're going to talk about next week, is the occupation. So, in what sense did the land rest from war then?
Well, we're not going to see any large coalitions gathering against the Israelites again until the time of the Judges.
Yeah, so the people can now dwell in the land safely because these inhabitants are not moving against them at this point. In Deuteronomy 12, in verse 9 and 10, for as yet you have not come to the rest in the inheritance which the Lord your God is giving you. But when you cross over the Jordan and dwell in the land which the Lord your God is giving you to inherit, and he gives you rest from all your enemies round you, so that you dwell in safety. So this is what's being described here. The Israelites are going to live in the land, safe from the other people who are living there still, as long as they continue to dwell and serve God as they should. And we see this in Judges. When they turn away and serve the idols, what happens?
Oppressed.
They're oppressed. And the peace, the rest, is broken. The judge arises, and then they judge the nation. The nation turns back to God. And we see over and over and over in in Judges, that the land had rest for X number of years while the judge served. And then that rest was broken. It's not that there was no battles or there were not enemies in the land, but there was safety from those enemies because of their adherence to follow God in their diligence. In the same way that we have rest and peace in this life. And we have a rest that's coming where we will be free from our enemies as well, because we have served God faithfully as well. Okay. Any comments or questions on that? You.
This fulfills the promise not only to Moses but to Abraham as well, because the land was given to them. And there seems to be still to this day a misguided idea that that land belongs to the Jewish nation. It was conditional. They were to drive out all of the inhabitants, or there would be thorns in their sides. And they didn't, and they have been.
Yes.
They didn't drive them out, and these nations have been the thorn in the side of the Jews for centuries.
Right.
Our salvation is conditional upon us maintaining the appropriate relationship to the Lord. It's all conditional.
It is. And we see that when we fail to serve, thorns will arise in our sides as well. Stumbling blocks and all kinds of things designed to push us back. Hopefully that they will, and then we can receive our rest. And we see that, again, in Judges, there were periods of rest when they served faithfully. But when they didn't, hard times came. All the way up to present day. Yeah, you're absolutely right. Great comment. Anybody else?
The way I think of when it says that the land rested from war, as was brought up, Israel had won. The land was theirs. There were no more major battles to fight. There would still be these skirmishes by comparison to what they've been through here and there that they would need to address when the time came. But for the most part, as previously stated, they were safe. They finally had room to breathe, to sort of build their cities, plant their flag, grow their crops, etc. within this land. So, and as for their enemies, they no longer had the strength to fight, so they backed down for the most part.
They never had the strength to fight, right? If you think about the inheritance that was promised, it wasn't just land. It was farms they didn't plant. It was cities they didn't build. All of this land was built and ready for them to come in and live their lives. They just need to go take it. And they did up until this point, right? Other comments? Yes, Laurie.
I think it's interesting, verse 21 and 22, where it talks about the Anakim, the giants.
Mm-hmm.
You just wonder how many giants were there, because total, obviously people were scared when they spied out the land and saw them, and then it says only in Gaza and Gath and then Ashdod. Well, we know in Gath, that's where Goliath comes from, right? And it just makes you wonder how many giant people were living in that whole land.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about these pockets of families and the way that they develop. And we're not told. We're told of Goliath being specific and sons of Anak, but it seems to me that there was a fair number of them, right? What's also interesting, as we're talking about that, is Caleb in chapter 14, we already talked about this a little bit, wanted Hebron because he wanted to push out the sons of Anak. This is chapter 15 now in verse 13 and 14. It seems that Joshua pushed the Anakim out for a period of time, and then some came back at some point, enough to know where Caleb needed to push them back out again. And that, to me, drives home the point of we've been fighting, or the Israelites here have been fighting for 5, 6, 7 years at this point, but they're not inhabiting cities. And so they captured cities in the south, and they moved to the north. What's happening to those empty cities down there? In theory, some of these Canaanites are trying to reassert themselves. And we see that when the Israelites are now occupying the land, the tribes are being distributed, and they're having to go back out and try to push out some of these remnants that are being left, such as the Anakim here in Hebron, which seem to sneak back in at some point. So there's still work to be done, but they certainly were given rest. Okay, let's go into chapter 12 here. Any other comments on this before we go into chapter 12? Okay. Chapter 12 here is a summary of the kings that have been captured up until this point. So we have the Promised Land as a whole. You have the Dead Sea, called the Salt Sea, the Sea of Chinneroth, which is the Sea of Galilee here, Jordan River between. And so initially, Moses here, this is verses 1 through 6, in the final months of his life, leads the army against, the Israelites against King Og of Bashan, and Sihon of the Amorites, which ruled half of Gilead. Og had the other half. And so they captured this territory here, the dark gray territories. All of this land and region was captured by Moses in Deuteronomy. Okay, and so we are now ready. And if you recall, Manasseh and Reuben and Gad, if I remember correctly, captured and claimed that land. Yes, Reuben, Gad, half of Manasseh, asked for this land. And so they were given that by Moses on the condition that they went into the land and continued to help their brethren fight. And so they did that. Then Joshua moved into across the Jordan, just north of the Dead Sea, and captured, so they captured that. And then Jericho Ai, and Bethel. So this was their journey into the central portion of the land. And they burned Jericho and Ai and captured them, killed their kings. All three of these kings are listed as being killed by Joshua in verses 7 through 24. Then they went to the south after the issue with the Gibeonites and captured these cities listed here south of Jericho. All of these cities here are listed as being destroyed and kings killed in the southern campaign. Then they go to the north, which is what we talked about today. Again, these are the same cities we just finished talking about, and their kings were killed, and their cities were taken and captured. Joshua's been busy doing what God is telling him to do, which is destroy these people, capture these cities as an inheritance, and burn those specific 3 cities we already talked about. But, as we said, there are pockets here where we're still seeing not cities, not kings mentioned in this chapter. And so when we get to some maps next week, we'll see these are actually areas where there are still Canaanites remaining in the chapter, beginning verses of chapter 13 here. What is the reason for Israel's success in these battles?
It's all attributed to God.
Yes, all because of God. Miles, were you going to?
In Luke 16, when Jesus says, he who is faithful in little will be faithful in much. And I think if there was ever a Bible character that exemplified that statement, it's Joshua, just because he started as Moses' assistant. And so I don't know exactly what his day-to-day tasks were, but he was faithful over little, and then now he's up against this massive horde, alliance, coalition, and he's fearless.
Yeah. And God gave them the victory. Yeah. We've talked about this before. What type of people was he leading against these warriors and these soldiers and these giants?
At this point, nomad.
They're nomadic people. They have little to no experience in battle, right? They have been wandering around. They don't have big armor. They don't have chariots of iron. They don't have horses. They're foot soldiers. They got some weapons. They have no experience fighting battles. But Joshua has been called to lead them. And God has promised that no man would be able to stand before him. And that's exactly what we see on this map. Right? No man was able to stand before him.
We also see some interesting military tactics in here, like for Bethel and Ai, they set an ambush, they have an all-night forced march and take the southern kings by surprise. Mm-hmm. They have a surprise attack on the northern kings. So, I mean, I'm not sure how much of this is God giving Joshua the battle plan directly and how much is Joshua's figured out some tactics. So, but even though they've got good tactics from a human standpoint, they still, in each case, they're attributing the victory to the Lord.
Yeah, over and over and over. And I mentioned several of the verses here on the slide right there. This was not a battle Joshua was winning based on human strength at all. You mentioned the military strategies. I wrote some of them down. The armies they were facing were stronger, larger. They were warrior peoples. They were outnumbered every single time. The walls of Jericho fell flat when nobody touched them, right? The armies in the south were routed and killed by hail rather than the sword, right? The sun and moon stood still. These are not things that can be attributed to any way to the people of Israel or the power of Joshua by himself. But it was because of his strength and his faith in God that he was able to do all of these things, right? Well, how can we apply this to our own lives?
Well, the Lord can do all of that. What problem do we have that's too big for him?
Yeah, we can do all things through Christ, right? As long as he is our strength. Yeah, good. Anything else, Stephen?
Yeah, it says that Joshua did everything that he commanded him to do. He kept everything he told him. And he was having him do a lot. So I'm not sure if he had a lot of free time. So the lesson for me is I need to do what he's asked me to do, no matter what it is. It's not too much.
Be busy about the Lord's work. Yeah, regardless of what it is. whatever we're called to do. Yeah, it's a great point.
So to go along with that, I often in my mind try to put myself into that planning strategy when they were about to go up to Jericho. And all these people have been wandering around, and now we're over in the land, and we're about to start our conquest. And they get together with all these people and say, okay, here's what we're going to do. Tomorrow, we're going to march around. And then the next day, we're going to march around again. Can you imagine from a soldier standpoint, or a nomad, whatever you want to call them? Really? And I think it's just amazing that that they as a group, Joshua leading, obeyed God and followed his path, and God delivered.
Yeah, they had very, very clear directions. And out of that battle specifically, only one strayed from the battle plan, right? It was Achan when he stole the things that did not belong to him. Joshua had everybody else going, even when it didn't make sense from a human standpoint. They were willing to follow it because they were willing to follow God in that path. Yeah.
It's a good example of leadership. Leadership goes top down.
Yep.
And, one of the best leaders that we can study from.
Yeah, he exemplifies a lot in the fact that he's also, as a leader, willing to humble himself and submit himself to the will of God. Tim?
Romans 8 talks about our victory in Christ, and it's like the same thing, parallels, and it talks about in 26, it says, in the same way, the Spirit also helps our weakness. And then if you drop down to 28, we know that God causes all things to work together for good, those that love God, those who are called according to his purpose. And then verse 31 says, if God is for us, who is against us? I mean, when things get bad and we are scared or intimidated, God's on our side, we win.
Right. Past victories should give us assurance of future victories. We see the battles that have been fought and won because God led them. We can win our own battles too because he should lead us. Last comment.
Well, what you just said, that's reason for us to study the Old Testament. So I understand we're under a better covenant, but you could say this is God's resume, so to speak, where all of these examples of victories is reason for us to go forward.
Yep, absolutely. Okay, thank you all so much. I think the bell should have rung, but I think we lost power. Did not ring. Okay, so we'll pick it up next week with Lesson 8, where they're starting to now settle the land. Thank you all so much.